Today, the inflation-deflation question. Hello again, it's Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics, where I'm latest posts covering finance and profit news with a distinctively Australian flavour. Today, I'm joined by Salvatore Babones from University of Sydney. Hi there.
Hi, how are you?
I'm pretty good. Yeah, pretty good. Look, we're going to have a bit of a sort of a two-way chat about the inflation-deflation question, right? Because it really is quite a fundamental question. And it looks to me as though if you look around the world, there's a bunch of people claiming that inflation is looming, it's all going to be very, very significant and, quick, and it's going to go a lot higher, and they point to bond rates and they point to this and that. And then, of course, the Federal Reserve turns around and says, well, there's a bit of transitory inflation, but there's nothing structural. And if you look around the world internationally, the central banks have been doing quantitative easing for years and years and years. None of them have been able to create any inflation. So the question is, what are we measuring, I suppose? Are we thinking about it in the right way? Or is it perhaps something more fundamental? And I've got some views about this perhaps being a little bit more fundamental than many people think.
Well, I'm not an economist, and I don't even pretend to be an economist like you do. So
you mean I pretend to be an economist too? Yeah. I'll take that on notice.
And so I'm not going to try to suggest what the future holds for inflation, but I have, at least at times in my academic life, been a measurement theorist. And I think it's important for people to realize that inflation is what we call a latent variable, meaning it's not directly observable. It's impossible to know what the general price level is. And so we can't know if it's changing. We can only surmise what the general price level is. The standard approach, I'm not teaching you anything here, but for some of the viewers, standard approach is the consumer basket of goods. So something like a CPI, a consumer price index, where you take the prices of a fixed basket of goods, you see what they are this week, you then look at the same basket of goods next week, and any change in the price between those two baskets is inflation. But of course, that causes problems because the goods we consume are always changing. We consume goods in different quantities as we shift between goods. We might substitute cheaper goods for more expensive goods. Quality is constantly changing, for better or for worse. Is a T-shirt made in Bangladesh this year the same as the T-shirt made in China last year? Is the cotton the same? And even to get more theoretical about it, do I subjectively value a T-shirt the same way now as I did last year? All of that's very difficult to measure, and that's why we're in this discussion today, because although I'm not going to try to tell you what the future of inflation is, I am curious what the actual rate of inflation is.
Well, you've hit the nail on the head, of course. There is no such thing as an objective, simple measure of inflation. I will agree with you on that. And some people will indeed use the basket of goods, but then you actually realize that they've changed the construction of the basket of goods over time. About 20 years ago, the Reserve Bank took land out of the CPI, which is one of the reasons why the CPI is probably lower than many people feel. You've also got this question as, a TV 20 years ago and the TV today has completely different functionality. So therefore, you cannot comparing apples with apples when you're trying to make sort of over time comparisons. So the whole question of using a basket of goods, does that make any sense? Other people will say, well, the best way to impute inflation is to look at monetary supply. If monetary supply goes up, then that's inflationary, right? Ipso facto, we've got inflation, except that currently what we've got at the moment is a massive increase in money supply. Even in Australia, it's up by 9% plus or whatever it is currently. And yet it hasn't really done anything, right?
But what's the money supply? So that's another measurement challenge. So the money supply is a subjective quantity. It's what I intend to spend. So if I have cash, M0 cash, under my mattress, if I have buried silver coins in my backyard. Is that part of the money supply? Now, of course, those are silly examples, but they just illustrate it. If I have money in my checking account that I'm keeping there with the idea that I might retire eventually, and it's just a poor way to do retirement savings, is that part of the money supply? But if the money is there because I intend to spend it on my groceries, then it is part of the money supply, right? So there's no such thing as the money supply, because money is a subjective concept. I mean, really, the only firm number we have is nominal GDP, is actual sales, right? What has actually been spent, that we know. But what was the average price of what was bought? Well, that's much harder. And I guess we should talk about the reason we're here talking about this today is that Martin last week had a great program about productivity growth and the problem of the stalling out of productivity. That productivity used to grow much faster, but in the last 20 years, it's been growing extremely slowly. But what if inflation is being mismeasured? What if, in fact, we've been experiencing deflation over the past 20 years? Then productivity growth, well, once you adjust for prices, productivity has been growing. You can restore productivity growth to its historical level if you assume we've been under measuring inflation, or put differently, over measuring prices.
Well, that is really the point, isn't it? And you're right. Monetary flow, you can measure all sorts of different ways, and it's relatively meaningless. We know it's higher than it was, but only in some categories, so that doesn't help. CPI, of course, we've said is an issue. GDP, of course, is also a bit of an issue. What you measure, how you measure it, right? So, I mean, basically, you've got wobbliness all over the place, right? So it's very difficult to get any clarity as to how to anchor it. I mean, it's also interesting, of course, because if you go back to the 70s and 80s, and I'm old enough to remember that, actually everything was very much driven by massive wages growth. So in fact, wages growth was the most significant indicator of the acceleration of everything, right? And then therefore that went forward from wages, putting prices up, et cetera, And in fact, we ended up with current cost accounting rather than standard accounting, because effectively the price of everything was moving up so much, so you had to adjust the accounts every year to give you a pre and a post inflation review, right? Oh dear, yeah. I can remember studying that.
Inflation accounting was a big deal in the 70s and 80s.
Yeah. Now, let me sort of stand back a bit and say, look, I think there's something really interesting here. If you take let's say an 80-year view of what's happened to nominal interest rates, right? They actually were quite low early on, and then they rose, they hit a peak in the 70s and 80s, and that was, of course, when Nixon sort of decoupled the US dollar from the gold standard. And then they've been drifting down and down and down and down, lower and lower and lower, to the point where we've now got nominal interest rates pretty much back to zero again, right? Now, some would say, is that 80-year cycle significant? Because if it is, it may well be that, in fact, the inflationary cycle that tracks rates means we're actually in a very low inflation environment in real terms, right? If you could find out how to measure it in the first place, right?
It's funny you should say that, because my original PhD proposal was on the Kondratiev cycle. And I actually have a paper currently under review on Kondratiev cycles. But I want to leave Kondratiev out of this. Kondratiev was the Russian economist who in the 1910s suggested that prices moved in these long, he suggested 70-year cycles. But leaving Kondratiev out of it, I think there's a lot of evidence for Kondratiev cycles. But let me just suggest to you, what if we have been overestimating prices for the last 20 years, meaning that we have been thinking that inflation was lower than it really is. Now, it's hard to use these words low and high, because I'm suggesting that inflation was really negative 1% per year when it really has been 1%. So I'm suggesting we've been in deflation for the last 20 years, but we've been mismeasuring that deflation. If that's true, then productivity growth has just been the same for the last 50 years. We had no crisis in productivity. It's just that real output is higher than we believe it is because we're adjusting for inflation improperly. We don't have the zero interest rate policies of the last 12 years. Well, why have they not stimulated greater growth? Because first, they have stimulated greater growth. Growth has been higher than we believe it is. Real growth, that is. And second, we don't have zero interest rates because, in fact, real interest rates are still positive. That is, if we believe that the rate of inflation for the last 20 years has been -1 or -2%, then interest rates have been positive, not zero. Wages then haven't stagnated, but wages have been perhaps growing in real terms. So this big mystery of why did wage growth end? Well, maybe wages are growing, but we don't know it. And I guess the ultimate test of that is subjective. Are we able to buy more with less? And if we can buy more with less, that's the very definition of deflation.
Well, and like I said earlier on, if you buy a TV today, you get a lot more than you did, and the price is a lot lower, right? So in some categories, it's absolutely clear that we're paying a lot less than we were, a decade ago. To give you an example, right? The sort of stuff I've got in the studio here to do my shows, right? I've spent a little bit of money, but I haven't spent anything like I'd have spent 20 years ago. To do the same, it would have been several $100,000, and I wouldn't have had as good a quality I've got today. So that's partly the technological revolution. It's partly the manufacturing capability that we've got and the ability to be able to use robots to be able to create more things more quickly. All of that stuff is in there, right? On the other hand, I guess there are other categories of costs, like fuel costs, right? For example, like electricity costs and things like perhaps food costs, which have gone up. And so actually the interesting question is, there are something's gone up, something's gone down. What's the net overlay of that? Well, it depends on individuals and their circumstances, right? In my surveys, I see a lot of people who say, the costs are really going through the roof, and I know that in real terms I'm going backwards, right? So that would suggest that there are some people who would say, well, yeah, I've definitely been in an environment where things have not worked out for me as well as I would like. There are others probably doing quite a lot better. And the other side of it, of course, is if you look at corporate profits have actually been remarkable. They've grown way faster than wages or inflation. So, maybe that's something else to think about in terms of the mix within the economy and where are all the flows going. And some of that perhaps is to do with, the financial management and the financial engineering that they've now got, and the bond, all those things are in there too. So, yeah, this is a very complicated beastie. But your fundamental observation, if it's true, would turn central banking on its head, wouldn't it?
Well, yes. But who knows? Look, I don't know that it's true, but as a measurement theorist, I suggest that it could be true and we wouldn't know it. And my only argument that it is true is really that it makes sense of a lot of data series that otherwise we say, the last decade or two have been the most exceptional period of the last 100 years. Or, we just got the measurement wrong, which would then explain everything. And the one I really want to work through with you, that I want to ask you about, is if in fact we've been in deflation without knowing it, would that explain the asset price boom? Since although nominal interest rates are near zero, it would imply, again, if I've got my economics right here, it would imply that assets are still productive in real terms. That is, the asset's not producing in nominal terms. The assets, the coal mine's producing coal. So is that connection between real interest rates being near, is that connection that nominal interest rates are bounded by zero in a world in which real interest rates are still above zero? Does that pathological situation explain the asset price boom?
Well, it's very interesting because I think we can all agree asset price boom there is. So house prices are much higher relative to every ratio you can possibly think. Stock prices never been higher as well. The indices are hitting all-time highs. Now, of course, the classic theory is that is because there's been a massive increase in debt and credit, and it's that debt and credit which has then stoked those asset prices, and it's actually a credit-led asset boom rather than a mispricing asset boom. But if your thinking is right, what that would suggest is that in fact it is less illogical than it might first seem because of the deflationary effect you're talking about.
Well, I don't know. Actually, I'm asking because asset prices are not my specialty in any way whatsoever. I mean, would deflation and thus positive real interest rates in a zero nominal interest rate environment, would that explain asset prices increasing? I don't have a big enough brain to work through that on my own. And you're much more the expert when it comes to real estate. Does that make sense to you?
Well, what it suggests to me is that people are looking for returns, and that's, if you like, through an investment lens, and so they are going to be looking for things where they think values are going to be higher later. And if you think about stocks, shares, that's where people have put a lot of money because that's where they think they can get the bigger returns, or indeed property. So there is actually a logic. And I actually think people are quite logical. They tend to want to actually place their assets where they can get growth. And liquid assets then can be converted into property or stocks and shares. The deflationary thing is interesting insofar that it changes the real value of things relative to the perceived value of things, right? And so if you're actually in a deflation environment where the cost of things are really going down and those asset prices are actually going up, it means that in real terms, they've gone up even more, doesn't it?
I don't know. So if I think about it, if you work through it, if I live in a home, I'm getting a stream of utility from that home that is independent of price levels and inflation, right? So the stream of utility is a real stream of utility. If the interest rates are high and I try to capitalize that stream of utility, of course, I get a low valuation for the asset. If interest rates are zero, of course, I can get an infinite value for the asset if interest rates were literally zero. But that's nominal interest rates. We're in a situation where I'm suggesting the real interest rate is still positive, but the nominal interest rate is zero. Now, the nominal interest rate approaching zero, that accounts alone for the boom in all these asset prices, I suppose. But I'm not sure what the deflation, the fact that we may be in a deflationary environment says about that. And if viewers have a solution for this, I know we have some real economists who view this. Give us the answer to that bit of equations, and I'd love to hear it. Back to the big topic, though, is the world deflationary? I mean, there's been this big mystery about why have we not seen the productivity effects of mobile, especially of the mobile phone, and particularly of the smartphone. And well, the smartphone is one area where we can see deflation in action, right? I mean, the capability has been increasing. Well, just take the Moore's law approach to capability. Maybe there's been a massive productivity bonus to the smartphone. We just haven't measured it, and that's my instinct.
Yeah. Or maybe having so many things to do on your smartphone, it means you're more distracted and therefore doing less in terms of outcome because
it's easy to joke about that, but when you see people handling their business email while walking down the street while walking their dog, we can think that's really silly, and it is silly. But it's a major increase in productivity. I mean, you and I are both old enough to remember the days when, communicating with someone in the office, took time, as opposed to, or for that matter, when you had to get together for a meeting instead of being able to communicate asynchronously. And I personally find it so beneficial for my real productivity, that is my physical productivity, that I can communicate asynchronously. that I think asynchronous communication, email, texting, etc., YouTube versus watching television. Asynchronous communication is such a boon to productivity that it's just not being captured. I mean, a YouTube video has much greater utility than a TV show, even though in the price statistics we might be considering them an equivalent product. Well, video on demand means I can watch it during times that for me are otherwise they're of low marginal utility. Versus video on television means I have to watch television on their schedule. Well, me being able to use time of low marginal productivity for watching television, as simple as something like that, is dramatically increasing productivity in ways that I suspect are not ever being captured in our official statistics.
Well, I tend to follow that line of argument, not least because I tend to dip in and dip out of things, and as you say, to optimize your day and your activity patterns, and then use the tools around you. By the way, I can remember the very, very first mobile phone that was ever invented. Right, it was about this big with a big antenna on the top. Right,
and you had two.
Well, that's
so
right.
You have someone to talk to.
It did actually connect to the old phone network, right? So it was literally of a similar size and shape of a standard phone, although it was a bit more elongated. But the point there was, the first time that came out, it was horribly weighty. The batteries didn't work very well, and it really didn't do much at all. But there came a crossover point, and we've now gone way past it, where that's just the normal course of business. I don't think we're measuring the difference between the old and the new at all, because of the fact that it's way more function rich, much more agile in terms of what it can do. And that's a good example of not measuring things right. And maybe that's partly where we're struggling here, because the rate of change is actually significant. The Moore's law is still running. The functionality we've got this week is better than last week. All of that should be factored in, but I'm not sure it is. So I'm not sure we've got any hope of measuring. And that suggests to me that the ABS and the other statistical organisations around the world are still in the old school, and they haven't really caught up with what's gone on.
Well, my real concern, and maybe this is something to think about concluding on, is that without good data, we can't make good policy. And I think we increasingly live in a world where it is, at least currently, impossible to collect good data on these things. I mean, we have some brute force methods, like for trying to measure the true money supply. There are economists who've thought about, well, you combine a survey where you ask people what is the propensity with which you would spend this certain asset, and then you try to weight various M1, M2, M3 components according to people's survey responses. But let's face it, that's not going to be a refined way to measure money supply in a practical way for central banks to make policy. There might be some future of the digital currency future that gives us new tools that allows us to properly measure these concepts like inflation and money, but that's on the horizon. And in the meantime, we might just be stuck making policy in the dark. And I'm not sure there's any solution to that.
Well, I would argue that the central banks around the world have been making policy on the run in the dark for a long, long time. They haven't necessarily achieved the outcomes that they set, right?
That's only because they don't subscribe to your surveys.
Well, that's probably true. Yeah, they should definitely get on the plan, right? Get on the wavelength. But the real observation here is that if in fact the things we're measuring are partial and incomplete, and if in fact the levers they're pulling are not having the effects that they think they're pulling, then we've got a huge policy vacuum, and yet we've got people standing up in front of press conferences around the world claiming that they are in control, they know where they're going, everything's fine. Maybe the emperor has no clothes.
Agreed. At least we're dressed.
Well, that's a good point. At least
we're not in charge.
I was going to say at least from the shirt up. Well, I appreciate that. Very interesting conversation, and got us all thinking. I shall look forward to all the economists watching, putting comments in the comments below, and see whether they can come up with the solution to your question, because it's a really challenging one, right? In a deflationary world, what's the real answer?